What does a ruin remember after the people are gone? Before history settles into dates and museum labels, there is a more fragile truth. Every civilization believes in some quiet way that it will last. Streets are laid out with care. Water is guided through channels. Walls are raised against weather, war, and time. Children grow up hearing the sounds of ordinary life and assume those sounds will always return with the morning. Then one day, for reasons clear or obscure, the rhythm ends. What remains is not only stone, but a question. This story begins in places where the ground itself seems to hold its breath. Across deserts, river valleys, coastlines, and high mountain plateaus, archaeologists have uncovered cities and strongholds marked by a strange signature. Stone fused as if softened by impossible heat, walls transformed into glassy surfaces, destruction frozen into matter. These are not simply ruins, they are scenes of interruption. Something happened here that the surviving evidence still struggles to name. For generations, people have tried to explain such places through the languages they had available. Myth spoke of fire from the sky. Epic poetry imagined divine weapons and blinding light. Religion framed catastrophe as judgment. Science, with its instruments and caution, looks for impact events, firestorms, warfare, seismic shifts, and the hidden mathematics of materials under pressure. Each approach tells part of the story. None fully dissolves the mystery, and perhaps that is why these sites continue to move us. Not because they prove a grand secret, but because they reveal a familiar human condition. We build, we flourish, we leave behind evidence of our confidence. And sometimes in the silence after loss, the earth preserves not answers, but traces. So we begin here at the threshold between memory and matter, where history is less a straight line than a field of scattered light. The ruins ahead ask for patience. They ask us to look closely. And above all, they ask whether the past is ever as distant as we would like to believe. What kind of fire leaves stone looking like frozen rain? On a hill in Scotland, the wind arrives first. It moves through the grass, over the heather, across the ruined ring of an ancient fort, and for a moment everything feels ordinary. Then you step closer to the wall. The rock is not rough in the way old rock should be. In places it has slumped, hardened, and gleamed, as though the stones once softened under a heat no hillside ought to know. These are the vitrified forts of Scotland, scattered across the highlands like unanswered sentences. Built more than 2,000 years ago, they were places of defense, refuge, and watchfulness. People stood here scanning valleys for movement, reading weather from the horizon, listening for hoofbeats or the approach of strangers. They chose these heights for safety, yet what survived was not only the outline of their walls, but evidence that those walls had been transformed. Archaeologists and material scientists have long wrestled with the same problem. To fuse stone, even partially, requires temperatures far beyond an ordinary blaze. Experiments have shown that timber fires can do remarkable things under the right conditions, especially when a structure is designed in a way that traps heat. Some researchers think the vitrification may have been intentional, a difficult and brilliant method of strengthening a rampart. Others believe it was accidental, the result of a destructive fire so intense that the stones themselves began to change. Neither answer is fully satisfying. That is what makes these forts so quietly haunting. They suggest a people more skillful than we once imagined, but they also remind us how quickly certainty breaks apart under close inspection. A wall can be both practical and mysterious. A ruin can be both evidence and question. And standing there with the wind moving through the broken line of stone, you begin to feel that history is not merely what happened. It is also what happened so completely that only transformation remained. Could a city vanish beneath a wave of heat and still leave behind the shape of daily life? Far from the green hills of northern Europe, another landscape carries a different kind of silence. In the Indus Valley, where some of the world's earliest urban civilizations once flourished, ancient streets still emerge from the dust in careful grids. Brick platforms, drainage systems, granaries, wells, these were not improvised settlements. They were planned places, built by people who understood order, water, labor, and time. Their cities were not fragile, they were thoughtful. And yet, at sites like Mohenjo-daro, the old confidence of that world is shadowed by disruption. Over the years, scattered remains, burned layers, and signs of abrupt decline have inspired theories both sober and extravagant. Some have imagined sudden annihilation, extraordinary heat, atmospheric catastrophe, even events so violent that later generations could only translate them into myth. Others urge caution. Civilizations can fade through drought, river change, trade collapse, disease, migration, or the slow fracture of systems that once appeared stable. The truth may be less theatrical and more human. A city does not need a single apocalyptic moment to become a ruin. Sometimes it is enough for the water to move elsewhere, enough for crops to fail twice in a row, enough for trade routes to thin, leaders to lose authority, families to leave one by one. The emptying of a city can be quiet at first. A shut doorway, an abandoned kiln, a street no longer swept by mourning hands. Still, something about these places resists easy closure. Their sophistication feels modern in spirit, and their disappearance unsettles us because it exposes a contradiction we still live with. Intelligence does not guarantee permanence. Planning does not defeat uncertainty. Even the most elegant systems remain vulnerable to forces beyond any map. So the ruins of the Indus do not simply ask what destroyed them. They ask something closer and perhaps more difficult. How does a world end when the people living inside it still believe it will continue tomorrow? What happens when memory turns disaster into legend, and legend into a warning no one can fully decode? In the ancient world, catastrophe was rarely described in the language of geology or chemistry. It arrived instead as story. Fire fell from heaven. The earth opened. A city offended the order of things and was answered by light, smoke, and silence. These accounts were not laboratory reports, yet they were never meaningless. They were humanity's first effort to give shape to the unbearable. Across many traditions, one pattern returns with striking persistence. A place of confidence meets a force beyond proportion. In some stories, the sky itself becomes an instrument. In others, the sea rises, the sun darkens, or the land is scorched so completely that what follows feels less like survival than remembrance. For modern ears, these narratives can sound exaggerated, but exaggeration may be the wrong word. Trauma often preserves feeling more faithfully than detail. That is why tales of destroyed cities still linger beside archaeological puzzles. A melted wall, a burned layer, a landscape altered by violence. These material traces do not prove every old story as literal fact. But neither should myth be dismissed as mere fantasy. Myths often carry emotional truth forward when precise knowledge has been lost. They preserve the scale of fear, the shock of rupture, the sense that ordinary life was interrupted by something that exceeded explanation. In that way, legend becomes a vessel. It carries fragments across centuries, not clean evidence, but echoes. It tells us how a people felt when the familiar world broke apart, and sometimes those echoes return us to the stones with new humility, not to confirm miracles or punishments, but to recognize that ancient people, like us, stood before events they could scarcely interpret and still tried to leave a record. Perhaps that is the deeper continuity between ruin and story. Both are incomplete. Both ask to be read with care. And both remind us that when human beings cannot fully understand destruction, we do what we have always done. We turn it into memory and hope memory will be enough. Can the ground itself remember a blow that no witness survived to describe? In some places, the answer may lie not in walls alone, but in the sky above them. Long before telescopes mapped the heavens with precision, the Earth was already keeping a different archive, one written in craters, shock layers, fractured minerals, and spheres of melted glass scattered across ancient terrain. For scientists, these are the signatures of impact, the quiet evidence that objects from space have repeatedly entered the human story, whether humans were prepared to name them or not. This possibility matters because certain ruined sites seem to carry marks of heat and force that feel out of scale with ordinary fire. Not proof of cosmic disaster, but an invitation to consider larger systems. A meteor airburst, for example, can unleash astonishing energy without leaving behind the kind of crater people expect. It can shatter forests, ignite broad landscapes, and send shockwaves across settlements in ways that survivors might later remember only as thunder, flame, and a sky that turned against them. Modern history offers a useful comparison. In 1908, over Siberia, An explosion flattened vast stretches of forest without the machinery of war and without a traditional impact crater. More recently, in 2013, the Chelyabinsk event reminded the contemporary world that the atmosphere itself it can become a stage for sudden violence. Windows burst. People were injured. The shock arrived before understanding did. If such an event happened above a Bronze Age town or Iron Age hill fort, what language would be left to describe it? Still, caution remains essential. Not every fused stone points to the cosmos. Not every burned ruin records a heavenly strike. The temptation to choose the grandest explanation is as old as wonder itself. Science earns its strength by resisting that temptation, by testing possibilities against evidence, by allowing uncertainty to remain where certainty has not been earned. And yet, the larger lesson endures. Human history has never unfolded in isolation from the planet or from the larger universe beyond it. We have always lived under a sky capable of beauty, indifference, and interruption. The ruins only make that truth harder to ignore. What if the mystery is not that ancient people were destroyed, but that they understood more than we expected about how to build against danger? For a long time, the past was flattened by its own distance. We pictured ancient communities as intuitive but limited, imaginative but technically simple. Then archaeology kept uncovering evidence that would not fit that old comfort. Precision stonework, complex drainage, astronomical alignments, metallurgy that demanded both patience and control. Again and again, the ruins corrected us. They suggested that intelligence is not a modern invention. It is a human constant. That shift matters when we return to vitrified walls and burned strongholds. Some researchers have proposed that certain structures were engineered with timber-laced masonry in ways that could, under sustained firing, create partial fusion. If so, the result may not have been an accident alone. It may have been part experiment, part ritual, part strategy, an attempt to harden defenses, seal walls, or transform ordinary construction into something more resilient. The line between destruction and design becomes harder to draw. Ancient builders worked close to materials. They knew how clay changed in fire, how stone fractured, how earth held heat, how wind could feed a blaze or steal it away. Their knowledge was rarely written in modern technical language, but it lived in practice, apprenticeship, and repeated trial. A wall was never just a wall. It was a judgment about weather, labor, available fuel, local geology, and the kinds of threats a community expected to face. Seen this way, the ruins become less like evidence of primitive helplessness and more like records of difficult intelligence. The people who raised these places were not standing outside history waiting to be overwhelmed. They were making choices within uncertainty, just as we do. Some of those choices worked for generations. Some failed spectacularly. All of them were human. And perhaps that is one of the quiet revelations buried in ancient stone. The past is not a gallery of lesser minds. It is a mirror. When we study what those builders knew and what they could not prevent, we are also studying the unfinished architecture of our own confidence. Why are some ruins most revealing not when they speak clearly, but when they refuse to fit the story we expected? Archaeology is often imagined as a discipline of discovery, but just as often it is a discipline of restraint. A wall is uncovered. A layer of ash appears beneath collapsed stone. A fragment of ceramic is found beside bone, charcoal, and glass-like residue. Each detail seems to promise a conclusion. Yet the closer experts look, the more the certainty begins to loosen. Evidence rarely arrives in neat agreement. It comes broken, displaced, altered by weather, looting, rebuilding, and centuries of human interpretation. This is especially true at sites touched by fire. Heat can preserve and erase at the same time. It hardens clay but destroys wood. It leaves a dramatic mark on stone, yet it can also scramble the sequence of events investigators most want to reconstruct. Was the blaze an attack, an accident, a ritual ending, a controlled act that escaped control, or the final chapter in a longer period of abandonment? The same blackened layer can invite several stories, and only one may be close to the truth. That uncertainty can feel frustrating, but it also reveals something essential about the way knowledge is built. The past does not surrender itself all at once. It must be approached through comparison, testing, doubt, and revision. New dating methods challenge old assumptions. Laboratory analysis refines what the eye once misread. Theories that sounded persuasive in one generation are quietly set aside by the next. In this way, archaeology is not merely a search for answers. It is a practice of humility. And perhaps that humility is part of why these melted ruins matter. They resist becoming easy symbols. They will not settle comfortably into myth alone, or science alone, or nostalgia alone. They remain more complex than the stories wrapped around them. That complexity is not a weakness in the record. It is the record. So when a ruin refuses to fit, it may be doing more than frustrating explanation. It may be teaching us how truth often survives, not as a single clean narrative, but as a pattern we approach slowly, with patience enough to let mystery remain honest. What do we do with a story that sounds impossible yet refuses to disappear? Across the deserts of northwestern India, heat is not an event but a season. It shimmers above stone, bends the horizon, settles into the body. In such a landscape, it is easy to understand why ancient poets reached for cosmic language. A battlefield becomes a sun, a weapon becomes a star. What cannot be measured is described through brilliance, ash, wind, and fear. For generations, readers of the Mahabharata have lingered over passages that seem to describe a force beyond ordinary war. A blinding flash, unbearable heat, poisoned ground, survivors marked by an invisible aftermath. Some have treated these lines as evidence of lost technologies. Others see them as what epics often are, moral and emotional magnifications of human violence, cast in images large enough to hold collective trauma. The temptation is to choose one side and dismiss the other. But the text may ask for something subtler. Ancient literature is rarely trying to behave like a modern report. It transforms experience into symbol. It enlarges events to express their human meaning. Yet symbols do not emerge from nowhere. They are built from memory, observation, fear, and the felt reality of destruction. A people who had seen cities burn, seasons fail, and landscapes become uninhabitable would naturally imagine catastrophe in elemental terms. Light too bright to face, heat too fierce to approach, silence after impact. That is why these stories still matter in a discussion of melted ruins and unexplained devastation. Not because they prove an impossible machine hidden in antiquity, but because they reveal how human beings remember overwhelming force. We turn disaster into language the mind can carry. We wrap the unbearable in metaphor. And perhaps that is the real inheritance of such texts. They remind us that long before science named blast waves or thermal pulses, human beings already knew the feeling of standing before ruin and realizing that some experiences arrive larger than explanation. How many endings can a city endure before we call its silence permanent? Not all ruins fall at once. Some are broken in a single violent hour. Others are worn down by centuries of pressure, so gradual that no one generation fully sees the collapse. A wall is repaired, then repaired again. Trade grows thinner, wells turn unreliable, harvests become uncertain, families leave for better ground, and those who remain inherit not a disaster but a diminishing horizon. The final ruin is only the visible edge of a much longer unmaking. This is one reason ancient destruction is so difficult to read. We are drawn to dramatic explanations because they offer clarity. A blazing sky, a sudden invasion, one unforgettable night, but history often resists that neatness. At many sites marked by burning or vitrification, the evidence may point not to a single cause, but to an accumulation of strain. Conflict layered over climate stress, structural weakness layered over human choice, ceremonial fire mistaken centuries later for catastrophe, or catastrophe woven into a place already under pressure. Seen this way, the melted stone becomes part of a larger portrait. It is not only a sign of heat, it is a sign of context. A fort was built because danger already existed. A city stored grain because scarcity was possible. Thick walls, elevated platforms, watchtowers, drainage channels, these are all forms of anticipation. The people of the past were not unaware of risk. They were living inside it, managing it as best they could. Sometimes they succeeded for generations. Sometimes the pressures converged faster than any system could absorb. That complexity may be the hardest truth to accept. We prefer the image of a lost world undone by one extraordinary event because it lets us separate ourselves from it. But a long collapse feels more intimate. It resembles our own age too closely. Institutions endure until suddenly they don't. Stability holds until it frays in several places at once. Then hindsight turns the pattern into inevitability. So the silence of ruined places may not belong to one ending at all. It may be the echo of many endings, arriving unevenly until a culture that once felt continuous becomes something we can only visit through fragments. What survives after destruction is not only evidence, but imagination. Walk through a museum long enough and you begin to notice how carefully the past is arranged for us. A shard in a glass case, a map with arrows, a label that reduces centuries to a paragraph. These are acts of care, but also acts of translation. They turn broken worlds into narratives we can carry home. Yet beyond the labels, every ruin still exceeds its explanation. It asks the viewer to do something science alone cannot do, to imagine life before the fracture. That act of imagination is not a betrayal of fact. It is part of how facts become meaningful. We study melted stone, scorched foundations, collapsed gates, and strange residues because they tell us something measurable. But we return to them because they also awaken something inward. Who stood here when the air changed? Who gathered children, water, tools, or sacred objects in the first moments of fear? Who believed the damage could still be repaired? The archaeology of catastrophe is always shadowed by the archaeology of feeling. This is where ruined places become more than technical puzzles. They reveal the ordinary human scale inside events that later generations describe as extraordinary. No city thinks of itself as a future mystery. It thinks of itself as home. Markets open, bread is baked, animals are fed, plans are made for next season. Then the unimaginable enters, whether as fire, drought, war, shockwave, or the slow failure of conditions once taken for granted. What we call history, they experienced as interruption. Perhaps that is why these ancient sites continue to hold such power over the modern mind. They remind us that civilization is both immense and intimate. It is built from systems, but lived through mornings. It leaves behind monuments, but it is sustained by habits so ordinary they almost disappear. When catastrophe comes, what is lost is not only architecture, it is continuity. And so the ruins ask us to look twice, once with the discipline of evidence and once with the humility of empathy. Between those two ways of seeing, the dead are not restored, but they are no longer entirely abstract. Could the real mystery be less about what ancient people lost and more about what we keep forgetting? Each generation approaches the ruins with its own vocabulary. In one century, melted walls become proof of divine wrath. In another, they are folded into imperial legends or nationalist pride. Later, they are tested in laboratories, dated by instruments, compared against geological models, and discussed in papers written with careful restraint. None of these approaches is entirely wrong. Each one reveals something about the ruins and about the people trying to understand them. What changes most over time, it is not the stone itself, but the questions we bring to it. Earlier ages wanted moral lessons. Modern culture often wants certainty, scale, and spectacle. We want the single explanation dramatic enough to quiet all competing doubt. Yet the past keeps resisting that demand. Again and again, ancient sites remind us that truth is often layered. Practical, symbolic, environmental, political, emotional. A ruined city may record an attack, a climate shift, a ritual ending, and a later myth all at once. That layered quality is difficult for the modern imagination, which is trained to sort causes cleanly and move on. But human history has never been clean. It is made of overlapping intentions, incomplete memories, and events no witness could fully see from inside them. The ancient world was not a stage arranged for our theories. It was a living field of choices, accidents, ambitions, and fears. The ruins preserve that complexity even when we would rather simplify it. There is also a quieter lesson here, one that reaches beyond archaeology. Civilizations do not only forget through collapse, they forget through confidence. Knowledge can be lost not because no one cared, but because later generations assume they already know enough. Curiosity narrows. Old warnings sound decorative. Skills once embedded in daily life become obscure. By the time the loss is recognized, the chain of memory has already thinned. So perhaps these burned and vitrified places endure as more than puzzles from remote eras. They stand as reminders that forgetting is not a failure of the distant past alone. It is a recurring habit of human beings. And every ruin asks the same patient question. What are we misreading now simply because our own world still feels intact? What if the most lasting power of these ruins is not what they explain, but what they teach us to notice? By the time we arrive at the edge of the mystery, something has shifted. The fused stone is still there. The burned layers remain. The theories still circle. Deliberate engineering, siege, wildfire, impact, ritual, environmental collapse, the long erosion of a world under strain. No single answer closes the door. Yet the search itself begins to feel meaningful in a different way. It changes how we look. We start by asking what happened to them. Gradually, another question emerges. How should we live with uncertainty when the evidence is partial, but the stakes feel human and real? The ruins offer a quiet discipline. They teach us to hold competing possibilities without surrendering to fantasy. They teach us to respect science without demanding that science turn every mystery into a neat ending. They teach us that wonder becomes deeper, not weaker, when it is joined by restraint. There is something profoundly modern in that lesson. Our own age is filled with signals we do not fully understand while we are living through them. Environmental thresholds, technological transformations, fragile infrastructures, inherited myths we still mistake for certainty. These are not ancient problems alone. The ruins speak across time because they reveal a pattern that outlives any one civilization. People build systems, trust them, depend on them, and only later discover where they were vulnerable. And still, the story is not bleak. To study the broken past is also to encounter endurance. The walls failed, but the question survived. The cities emptied, but their makers were not erased entirely. Through fragments of stone, ash, and story, they continue to enter our imagination. They ask us to become better readers of both history and ourselves. So as we move toward the final chapters, the melted ruins no longer seem like evidence of one forgotten catastrophe alone. They become something larger, a meditation on attention, on how easily we overlook the limits of our knowledge, and on how, if we are careful, the silence of the past can still teach us how to listen. When we stand among these ruins, what are we really looking for? An answer or a reflection of our own fragility? By now, the scattered sites begin to speak to one another. The vitrified forts on their windswept hills, the ancient cities of the Indus, shaped by order and touched by disappearance. The old epics, carrying catastrophe forward in images of fire and unbearable light. The geological record, quietly reminding us that the earth and sky have always moved according to forces larger than any human design. Separate at first, these threads now gather into one larger meditation. What they reveal is not a single hidden event waiting to be named. It is something more subtle and perhaps more unsettling. Human beings have always lived between mastery and vulnerability. We learn to cut stone, guide water, read seasons, fortify hills, preserve memory, and explain the world with whatever language our age can offer. Yet none of those achievements fully remove us from uncertainty. The same intelligence that builds a civilization cannot guarantee that civilization's permanence. This is why ruins carry a special emotional weight. They are not only remnants of failure, they are monuments to effort. Every burned wall and fused stone once belonged to a plan. Someone measured it, lifted it, trusted it. Someone believed that this structure would hold against weather, enemies, hunger, time. In that sense, ruins are not the opposite of hope. They are what hope looks like after history has passed through it. And perhaps this is the true continuity between their world and ours. We also live inside systems that feel durable until they are tested. We also rely on knowledge that may prove incomplete. We also tell ourselves stories about safety, progress, and control. The ancient past matters not because it is distant, but because it is recognizable. So before this journey closes, one final thought lingers in the air, like smoke above old stone. Maybe the mystery was never only how those places were broken. Maybe it is how human beings keep building, keep remembering, and keep searching for meaning, even after the evidence of impermanence stands plainly before us. In the end, the ruins do not yield a final verdict. They leave us with something both smaller and more profound. a way of seeing. We began with melted stone and ancient walls marked by impossible heat, with cities that seemed to end too suddenly or too strangely, with stories that carried catastrophe in the language of fire, sky, and memory. We looked for causes, for mechanisms, for one clear line through the evidence. What we found instead was a landscape of overlapping truths. Some sites were likely shaped by war, some by environmental stress, some by accident, by design, or by forces from beyond the horizon of ordinary experience. Many may never be fully explained. But the deeper meaning of these places does not depend on a single answer. Their power lies in what they reveal about the human condition. We build carefully, often beautifully, and always with the quiet belief that our structures, physical or cultural, will outlast the moment that created them. Then history reminds us, sometimes gently and sometimes without mercy, that permanence is never guaranteed. And yet this is not a story about despair. It is a story about continuity. The people who shaped those forts, fired those bricks, walked those streets, and told those stories were not shadows waiting to disappear. They were thinkers, makers, parents, planners, witnesses. Their worlds were fragile but not meaningless. Their remains ask us to look past the spectacle of destruction and see the dignity of what existed before it. Perhaps that is the final lesson of these mysterious ruins. Not that the past was filled with secrets meant to thrill us, but that it was filled with lives as real to themselves as ours are to us now. The stones endure because they were touched by human intention. The questions endure because human curiosity does. So the last image is not of annihilation, but of attention. A person standing before an ancient wall, hand resting on cooled and altered stone, feeling across centuries the strange closeness of all vanished things, and asking with humility what we owe the past, not certainty perhaps, but remembrance, care, and the courage to keep listening when history answers in fragments.